All right, good afternoon again, and welcome to this Translational Applications in Public Health lecture. I'm Rich D'Aquila. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. This lecture series, as you all know, is a collaboration between the Institute for Public Health and Medicine and the Northwestern Clinical and Translational Sciences Institute. I have the privilege of directing the NUCATS Institute. So thank you all for joining us in person and online. I want to let you know that you will have time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. So use the Q&A function on Zoom rather than the chat to submit any questions. Today's presenter is Dr. Nathan Walter, who's an associate professor in the Department of Communication Studies here at Northwestern. He's also the founder and co-director of the Center for Media Psychology and Social Influence, where his research focuses on the power of strategic storytelling and the role of emotion and affect in social influence. Dr. Walter will present findings from his work on the continued influence of misinformation and the ability of nonpartisan fact-checking to challenge the veracity of false information. He'll explore various psychological mechanisms that underlie these effects and provide recommendations for more effective correction efforts. Thank you, Dr. Walter, for joining us. It's all yours.
Thank you so much. Hey, can you hear me? Thank you for joining this conversation. I was told that because we have folks joining on Zoom, I can move from here to here. So if you see me do some pantomiming, there's an invisible wall, and it's right here. First of all, I want to acknowledge the wonderful humans that help produce a lot of the research that I'll share with you. This is the PhD students in the Center of Media Psychology and Social Influence, very close to here in Abbott Hall. So next time, if you need to renew your wild card, stop by, say hi. When, you know, the worst possible thing for someone like me is to be invited to give a talk and say, no, you can talk about whatever you want. So I really went back and forth with what I want to talk about, and thought, you know, one talk that I didn't really get a chance to do is, instead of presenting one piece of research, maybe just give you a general overview of what we do, or just try to answer the question, why are we so susceptible to misinformation, highlighting different types of findings and evidence from media psychology. And I hope that this could be very interactive. So for instance, I'll ask you all, do you see any problem here? What's the problem? This, exactly, but it's definitely not an apple. This is an apple, right? Anyone knows what this is? This is called the vegetable lamb of Tartary, and you can't really get it now at Trader Joe's, but for roughly 400 years in the Middle Ages, people were absolutely certain that there is a tree, that lambs grow from that tree with flesh and blood and wool and everything. More than that, leading, you know, quote unquote scientists of the day claimed that they studied it, and it took 4 centuries to identify this as a piece of folklore, as a piece of myth. And the question is, you know, why, when something is so clearly false, can persist? Anyone knows what this is? Still staying within the world of produce. This is apricot seeds or apricot kernels. According to some, this is also a very effective cure for cancer. So I found this thing online. Twice, Jason Vale was diagnosed with cancers that should have killed him. But 30 years after the first tumor was found in his chest, He's still alive. The reason, you guessed it, not chemo, not radiation, no cancer drugs or surgery, apricot seeds. The problem is not only that they're not very effective, they can be quite deadly. Here a person poisoned himself and eventually Vail and his mother were arrested. But this is not the only story. I also found this one. Dr. Ernst Krabs was a biochemist fascinated by the lifestyle habits of the ancient Hanzas, remote people near northern Pakistan. They enjoyed near perfect health, lived to incredible old age, no obesity, no disease, no cancer. Again, the truth is apricot kernels. And I'll be honest with you, I didn't have the faintest clue who the ancient Hanzas were. So I did what every professor would do. I checked it on Wikipedia. Literally, the first line says, a widely repeated claim of remarkably longevity of the Hanza people has been refuted. Not only that they didn't live until old age, they died very young, like other poor areas near Pakistan. But what about Dr. Krabs? Remember the doctor? So I also Googled him and realized, oh, not only that he's not a doctor, he has no authority to talk about anything related to cancer or apricots. And I know what you're asking yourself. You're thinking, Nathan, where are you finding this garbage? So let's look at WebMD. According to some, this is a highly trustworthy source for medical information. I just looked at the user ratings and I searched for apricot kernels as a cure for cancer. You can see the ratings, almost perfect. And I promise you that if you do the same experiment back home, and instead of apricot kernels, you search for something like chemo or surgery as a treatment for cancer, the ratings are not as great. It's not almost 5 stars. So the notion that people are misinformed about politics, science, environment, obviously health, has reached the point of truism. I'm curious, why does it happen? And I'll try to point to several different options, and what all of them have in common is, and this is the depressing part of today's talk, all these things are kind of baked into who we are as humans. So let's start. Can you look at this list of words? Yeah, let's give you like a few more seconds. Look at the words. One reason why we're misinformed might have something to do with memory. You remember from Snow White, was it mirror, mirror on the wall or magic mirror on the wall? Who thinks that it was mirror, mirror on the wall? Raise your hands. How about magic mirror on the wall? Go check the script. How about Darth Vader says, no, I am your father? Show of hands. Or Luke, I am your father. Again, go rewatch it. That's a tricky one. Jiffy or Jif, which one is the peanut butter? Who thinks that it's Jiffy? How about Jif? I see, yeah, doing well. 33% of that, excellent. But again, these are just kind of nonsense. Why would you remember it? We all have these glitches in our memory. The question is, what happens when we're trying to recall what we call light bulb memories? These very, very, very important things that happen either to us personally or we experience them as a collective. For instance, if I'll ask you, show of hands, how many of you remember what you were doing on the day of the January 6th insurrection? Show of hands, how many of you remember? Almost everyone. We don't have time to go one by one and test it, but I do want to share with you some interesting results that essentially are trying to compare these, what we call flashbulb memories with ordinary memories. So some of you are probably even weren't born when 9/11 happened, but clearly a major event. Immediately afterwards, a team of researchers asked people, what were you doing on the morning of September 11th? You know what, let me ask you, those of you who were born, show of hands, how many of you remember what you were doing? Everyone, excellent. And here you can see what they found. So again, they're trying to compare ordinary with flashbulb memories. They found that flashbulb memories are very similar to ordinary memories in the sense that after a while, we're not as consistent when we need to tell what happened. So they ask people, what were you doing on the morning of 9/11 versus what you were doing just on a random day that they selected. Over time, the facts that we tell become less consistent. And just to clarify, that would mean that if I'm saying on the morning I was having breakfast with my friend Jenny, and then after a few months I'll say I went to the gym in the morning, that would be inconsistent. But if I'm saying I had breakfast with Jenny versus I had breakfast with a friend, that would still be consistent. So we see that flashbulb memories are very similar to ordinary memories in that respect, but they're quite different in other, much more dangerous respects. We believe that they are accurate, and we tell them in more vivid terms. So still, over time, you can see here, everyday memories in green, flashbulb memories in red. Doesn't matter. They become less accurate, like we saw earlier, but at least from our perspective, we believe that they are true, and they remain as vivid. Show of hands, how many of you think that the word king was on the list that I shared with you earlier? How about chair? What? How did that happen? Memory is reason number one. Not only that we all have a faulty memory, it's very easy to manipulate. I can just spend the next 2 hours just playing these priming games with you. We're all susceptible to this. Another reason has to do with what we call motivated reasoning. So people were asked, human beings as we know them today developed from earlier species of animals, true or false? Essentially, they want to know whether people are aware of the theory of evolution. As you can see here, the higher the science intelligence, so basically science literacy, the more likely people to get the answer right. But it's not a very strong effect. However, if we separate this data based on level of religiosity, all of a sudden we find that those who are less religious are more likely to know the right answer. Does it mean that religiosity is a problem? Of course not. It's how we ask the question, because if we slightly change the question and we ask people, according to the theory of evolution, the effects of religiosity goes away. So that will tell us that there's something else at play. It's not like people don't know the real answer. They are not saying the right answer because they know what it would mean. Similarly, people are asked, there is solid evidence of recent global warming. If we separate it based on political ideology, liberals are more likely to get the question right. It doesn't necessarily mean that they know better, just simply means that this is their motivated reasoning. So it's not gonna surprise you that people are motivated to discount information that often doesn't fit within the worldview. When something fits within our worldview, we tend to immediately accept it. We just nod along, we agree with it. When something doesn't agree with us, we tend to challenge it. We tend to derogate the message. So we can think about this as sometimes we're motivated by accuracy, right? We have the target and we're trying to be as accurate as possible. Sometimes we're motivated by something like consistency. We already know what we want to believe, and we're trying to just fit whatever happens in the world within our belief system. The problem with health, of course, it used to be the case that people would be motivated by accuracy. Now, more and more, we see people make decisions about health in a similar manner that they would make decisions about politics. This is one of the most fascinating findings we have around motivated reasoning. So if you look at, on the left, you see this is the crowd for Obama's inauguration in 2008. On the right is a crowd for Trump's inauguration in 2016. Show of hands, how many of you think that Obama's inauguration had more people? So people are asked, and as you can see here, 40% of Trump voters thought that the Obama inauguration was actually Trump's inauguration. Makes sense, right? You want your guy to win, more people. That makes sense. What I can't make sense of is this. 15% of Trump's voters looked at these two photos and they said, you know what, the one on the right has more people. As if we're completely ignoring reality. Theoretically speaking, I could ask you what you're thinking about. I don't need to, because we all have a similar brain. I know that you are either thinking about bananas vomiting or something that looks a little bit like bananas. What is so fascinating, no effort, you were able to create that story in your head immediately, just by showing you two words that are seemingly unrelated. So it seems that our brain works constantly like an associative machine. And I'm sure that at some point you had a professor, instructor, maybe you are that professor who said correlation is not causation, which is absolutely accurate, but there's a reason why we see cause and effect everywhere. And it's critical for survival. Because if today you're on the train, the person next to you is sneezing and coughing, tomorrow you wake up with a fever, the ability to connect these two events is obviously critical for our survival. So it seems like we're predisposed for storytelling. Ask you another question. Let's see if you know the answer. How many of you know the answer? Just raise your hand. What's the name? Okay, I have no way to check. I'll trust you. Same thing. Let's see if you know the answer. Show of hands. How come? How come that it's much easier for us to remember why Pinocchio's nose is growing than the name of our second grade teacher? We theoretically learned this information around the same time. I hope that the identity of your teacher was more important than Pinocchio. And yet when we need to retrieve it from our memory, Pinocchio's easy, effortless names are much more difficult. There seems to be some kind of a bias towards storytelling. In our research, we call this often mental models, which is based on the assumption that the only way that we can understand the world as storytellers is to tell stories about this world. So for instance, a very coherent mental model would be strong and influential people are influencing doctors, and these doctors in turn inject vaccines that are dangerous into people. Now, this is a very false mental model, but it's very coherent mental model. One of the frustrating findings that we find time and time again is, for instance, with fact-checking, if we just invalidate one part of that story, we just are saying, no, doctors are actually wonderful. They want to help us. They're not bad people. We end up with a gap in our mental model. And as storytellers, we're so terrible at having gaps in our story. So over time, people will go back to the mental model that is more coherent, albeit false, but still more coherent just because it makes more sense. And probably one of the greatest examples we have from, in the wild is the story around Listerine. Now, anyone knows why we would use Listerine? Breath, mouth hygiene. Anyone who uses Listerine to cure a sore throat? No. But for nearly 50 years, Listerine was marketed as a cure for colds and sore throats until the Federal Trade Commission, and it took 50 years, said either show the evidence or correct that misinformation. You have to finance a big campaign that will convince people that you were basically lying to them. So that's exactly what they did. And to cut a long story short, they found that people continue to believe that Listerine will cure their sore throat. The campaign didn't work. It didn't matter whether the source of the message was the FTC or the company that produces Listerine itself. People continue to believe. What's quite remarkable, of the 42% that continue to believe that it has this miracle effect, 57% of them use Listerine for that specific purpose. So you see, once you have that mental model of what Listerine does, it's very difficult to correct it without providing a more coherent alternative mental model. By the way, the other day, right, this is happening 50 years ago, I went on this very popular blog called Live Strong. And, one of the stories telling us, most people know how to swish and gurgle for oral hygiene, but when and how to relieve a sore throat is less common knowledge. So even today, many, many years later, we have this very persistent misconception. Going back to the idea of vaccine, I really like that example. I saw that this virologist, basically, instead of debunking one piece of the mental model, he tries to correct that misinformation about vaccines, but still making it fit the existing mental model. So basically he says, you're right, big pharma are terrible, but they're so terrible that if they really want to make money, they should let you get sick. They will make way more money from that, not from the vaccines, from the cures, not from the vaccines. So this is a very interesting approach that acknowledges this challenge that we have with mental models. How many? Moses? What? I feel like it's been a minute since you've been to Bible school. Why did it happen? I promise you that if I were to show you this font, fewer of you would make the mistake. This one is this fluent. You have to stop when you read this. It's slowly, you're a little bit more critical. When something is fluent, we just tend to accept that we're not alone. It feels familiar, feels safe. Which one is a safer roller coaster? When we randomly assign people and we ask them, this is Ohanzi, how safe is it? This is Chachili. People would say Ohanzi. Which one is more fun? The disfluent one. Less familiar, riskier, different. Which one is a safer drug? Again, the fluent one, the familiar one. Which one might be more effective? Disfluent, less familiar, different. A lot of the naming of drugs is based on this notion. You don't want things to be very fluent, especially if it carries some risk. So we know that fluency equals familiarity. This metacognitive experience of it's easy to process, I tend to agree with it. People are also more likely to believe people with more fluent names. So if some of you are doctors, you have patients, make sure that you have a very fluent name. if you want people to trust you. More people are likely to say, yes, turtles are deaf when the statement is attributed to Babeshko than Cherchinsky. What's so interesting, as you might suspect, these effects are 100% culture dependent, because if you're Eastern European and both names are as easy for you to pronounce, the effects goes away. So it's not surprising, and here you can see a post with a lot of misinformation about the Zika virus, that often when we look at bots, they all have very fluent names. Tyler Johnson, you know? It's all based on this assumption. By the way, anyone remembers what's the name of our Secretary of Transportation? Buttigieg. And when he was running for the Democratic ticket, pretty soon he realized no one's going to elect a guy named Buttigieg. So he did what? He changed it to Mayor Pete. Is there anything more fluent than Mayor Pete? One of the most effective users of this principle of fluency and disfluency is Trump. So if you think about the thing that he botches, it's, you know, China, Kamala Harris, you make it sound disfluent, you make it sound less familiar, dangerous, risky, other. So that's another reason. Show of hands. How many of you would eat one cherry from a bowl filled with cockroaches? No one? Not even if you're hungry? Silly question. How about this one? Bowl of cherries, only one cockroach, like a baby, tiny one. Still, no one? Okay. We're all so predisposed to identify negative information that even one very, very negative thing can completely color what is otherwise very positive. Let's try this little experiment. What do we see? 3, 2, 1, anger. No one thought that this is sadness or happiness or joy or guilt. Effortless, immediately anger. Let's do one more. 3, 2, 1, 408. What? You know, it's not very difficult. If I give you a minute, we'll be able to solve it. But this is different. Blood is rushing to our head. We get concerned. We need to think about it. We're so good at identifying emotions. Immediately, effortless. And when something is effortless, just like with the stories, just like with every other example that I showed you, it means that it's baked into who we are. We've been just using the same thing for millennia. This is new. Numbers, risk perceptions are new, are different, much more effortless. I can ask you who's the, what's the first face that you're focusing on? I don't need to. It's always the angry face. As humans, we call it also the negativity bias. In a crowd, we will immediately identify the angry face. Why? Makes total sense. It's way more important for us to know what's the risk, where's the threat coming from. If we're at a park and we hear someone shouting, that will immediately draw our attention. When someone's laughing, not so much. It's again baked into who we are. Now, how is this related to misinformation? It's related to misinformation because it tells us that whatever is negative is more likely to draw attention. Do this little experiment right now. Go and check what's the most viral content right now. And it's typically anger-inducing, fear-inducing stuff, or soldiers coming home to their dog for some reason. But the negative stuff tends to be very, very, very viral. So we know that people are more likely to pass along negative content on social media. Again, survival instinct makes total sense. And if we think about it from the perspective of misinformation again, the misinformation is typically, the government is colluding to infect everyone with COVID-19, and then the correction is no, the government is doing good things, they want you to be healthy. So there seems to be an inherent benefit to misinformation just because it's so negative. Planned Parenthood is harvesting baby parts. That's very negative. People are more likely to remember it. People are more likely to pay attention to that. No, Planned Parenthood are doing a lot of good things. People are less likely to remember and pay attention to it. So now the question is, and we have more time for discussion, but maybe in our discussion we can talk a little bit about how we can unring that bell, how we can start correcting some of that misinformation. So with that in mind, let's have a discussion.
Okay, we will bring you a microphone so that our colleagues on Zoom can participate as well.
Was it just me, or were those two roller coasters and those two bottles of pharmaceuticals identical?
They are identical. So this is from experiments where we randomly assign people either to the fluent name or the disfluent name. And we ask them, it needs to be identical because the only thing that changes is the name. And when it's less fluent, when it's more fluent, people are more likely to think that it's trustworthy. Yeah, great point.
So what I heard was that if we wanted to fight misinformation that is capitalizing on more attention being paid to negative messaging, we have to fight the negative with other negative messaging, but ultimately with it being good messaging.
That's such a great question. I'm always debating whether I should say what I really think or give kind of the kumbaya answer. Because what I really think is, for really good reasons in our society, we often think that as medical experts, we should just use hope appeals and gain frames. But there is a good reason why fear appeals work so much. This is such an instinct that we have. So for instance, there's a lot of research around what is called death narratives, where you tell stories about people who were very outspoken against COVID vaccines, and now sadly they're no longer with us. These are very, very effective. For obvious reasons, people are a little bit hesitant to use them, but it's true. We should fight negative with negative, and also often we should fight fiction with fiction. Because I always do this experiment in class. I can mathematically prove that vaccines don't cause autism, because you can just calculate the number of kids born in the US every year, the incidence of autism, how many of them are vaccinated, when are they vaccinated, the number of days, between the age 0 and 24 months, and you can just know how many kids every year will develop autism just by chance immediately after they get the shot. And then I'm showing students a story from a mother who took her sweet little baby boy, who was laughing and joking, and then the doctor was so mean and insensitive and he didn't want to hear anything about the baby being sick at the time. He said, I'm going to vaccinate it anyway, because if I wouldn't vaccinate sick kids, I wouldn't vaccinate kids at all. They're always sick. And he gives the shot, and then the baby develops autism. You just can't argue against personal stories. So that's a very long way to say, yeah, I think that we need to fight it with often negative information as well. Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, great talk. I was wondering, going back to the idea of unringing the bell, I know media has a huge impact on how we see the world. And taking January 6th as an example, it was manipulated by certain news outlets. And I think that's where some people are beginning just to lose faith in this popular media and are looking for not conspiracy theories or fake news, but rather alternative views because they can't count on media anymore. And I was wondering if you could make a comment on that and how we can address that.
Yeah, so
I personally think some of these conspiracies or fake news, they're alternative viewpoints. And I think that's healthy because otherwise we will go down that kind of rabbit hole and that whole tribal thinking that we're all thinking the same way, but throw in some alternative viewpoints. I think that's important.
I think it's very, very important. So trust is constantly going down. And I don't think that we are as effective as utilizing new media as some of other sources. I think that conspiracy theories have the inherent benefit of being great stories. Because once you are not committed to truth, you can just tell the best story ever when there's no gaps, everything connects, everything fits within the worldview. So I think that conspiracy theories are different from that respect. I would like to see a little bit more diversity with the sources that we use. For instance, credibility. What is credibility? We often think that credibility is the same as expertise, meaning you have the training and the knowledge and the skills. So someone like Fauci would be very, very credible. Not necessarily. He has high degree of expertise, but credibility is also trustworthiness. So from that perspective, someone like Joe Rogan has a lot of trustworthiness, not expertise, but he has, among some segments of the population, so much more credibility. These are different. Fauci knows the truth. I don't know if he will tell me the truth. Rogan maybe doesn't know the truth, but to the extent that he knows something, he will share it with me because he's like a friend. So I think that what we need is not necessarily a kind of different takes on medicine, but maybe just a more diverse set of spokespeople.
We have a question from the Zoom audience from Natalie Olson. Are motivated reasoning and confirmation bias the same thing?
Oh, we can spend hours on this. This is also splitting hairs. This is my favorite thing. They are not the same thing because motivated reasoning is a more elaborate framework that just based on this notion of a hierarchy of needs. So it basically tells us, it's not like people are not, accuracy seems to be an important factor. We all want to think of ourselves as being motivated by accuracy, but actually if you think about the needs that humans have, the need to belong is often more important than the need to be accurate. So from that perspective is a much more interesting framework that tells us not only the bottom line, like confirmation bias, but it will also tell us why people do what they do and also what happens in that moment. What does it mean when someone is motivated to reach the most accurate decision versus the most consistent decision? How does it relate to their level of elaboration, their level of derogation, the level of cognitive effort. So I think that one is a framework, the other is just like the bottom line, the confirmation bias is just the bottom line effect that you see.
So within kind of the same realm, how do you reconcile the difference between people who, absorb this misinformation and those who are just willfully ignorant, who will argue, a wrong point to no end, and also have an issue, and I feel like we've seen this a lot within the last several years with, intellect, with education. How do you?
Well, not to be very controversial, but I don't think that media literacy or news media literacy or health literacy is the solution. Because in our research, what we see, people that opt out for alternative treatments, for instance, for colon cancer, tend to be more educated. So it's not so much the problem with education. I think that the problem is we have this access to information and we are not really trained in doing our own research and spending 5 hours on YouTube. This is not research. Otherwise, I would publish way more. So the idea is it's not information deficiency. It's almost like information overload. And we need to think, how do we make sure that people are exposed to good information? I'm a little bit pessimistic because just to make it clearer, all the things that I wanted to show is basically, yes, we're misinformed, but the reason why we're misinformed, it's very inherent to who we are. So we all make that false connection between events. Correlation is not causation, but in some cases, it's a survival mechanism. So maybe rather than talking about health literacy or news literacy, we need to start talking about something like human literacy, just knowing our biases.
You brought up some good points about political polarization and its impact on trust. I know Pew has done some research that shows that there's a partisan divide in trust in biomedical scientists. And so combining that with information about misinformation and belief in that, do you think there should be targeted strategies along those lines? And how might we address that if there is a growing partisan divide, and also as that relates to our work as scientists and our funding as scientists?
Yeah, this is an excellent point. I think, I don't know if there's an easy solution there. It gets really challenging because as a scientist who focuses on misinformation, I often feel like there's a spotlight on what I do. And every case study that I choose, like, why did I show you Trump and I didn't show you the other side? So it feels like people are, it's easy to fall in these traps. And then you are stained. And then when I talk about my area of expertise, I know my view is no longer valid. So I think that there are these moments, these opportunities that we have, and we need to seize those opportunities. For instance, I always felt like it was a mistake not to acknowledge all the contribution that Trump had to developing the COVID vaccines in the US. Because that will tell you, if this is your leader, if this is your representative, you should care about their success. And instead, it turned into this partisan thing. So I think that every time that we can somehow bridge those divides, it's very, very important. I would just say as a side note, not completely related to health, but there's really not a lot of opportunities to see the other side, to meet the other side, like we used to, let's say, on popular media. There's not a lot of TV shows for the broad audience that show good examples of liberals, good examples of conservatives talking together, engaging together. So I think that maybe more of that would help as well.
Can you talk a little bit more about making misinformation and secondary gain explicit? For example, the believability of someone's name, the name, presumably we're born with that and they didn't choose it. Is random or related to where their ancestry, as opposed to stories that are purposely misinforming for someone else to make money.
Mhm. So, I'll address both parts. Regarding the name, fluency is such a basic principle. You see it all the time. So you ask yourself the question, well, how come we have still people believing that there was major fraud during the 2020 elections? Well, if you go back and you look at who were the people that were talking about election fraud, we're not talking about 200 people or 100 people. We're basically talking about 4 people within the same circle. The reason why it was so successful, they constantly repeat the message. And we see in our research that repetition at some point just sounds like a chorus. Even, and this is the remarkable piece, if it's the same person repeating their opinion all the time. Still, that influences how we perceive consensus. So I think that there are ways to influence fluency and make accurate information more fluent just by repeating it more and making it simple for people to understand. The piece about disinformation, I think, is a little bit more challenging. It's very difficult. For instance, I teach classes on misinformation, and it's very difficult to find clear examples of disinformation where you see the intent to disinform, as opposed to misinformation, we just happens with no intent. So we know, for instance, with tobacco, because through litigation, everything became publicly available. You can read about all the variety of ways that they try to misinform the public. Is there a way? Does it mean that it's easier to correct? No. It just means that we should be able somehow to disincentivize people from knowingly spreading disinformation. Most of the biases that I talk about are happening at the psychological level, at the individual level. But if we zoom out for a moment and we just look at our media landscape, it's terrifying. We have an economy that's motivated by clicks and views. There are no repercussions for non-institutional actors who knowingly spread disinformation. So I think that maybe that's part of the challenge, to create policies that will discourage people from spreading disinformation. But in terms of looking at the bottom line effects, is there a difference in how we correct that misinformation? I'm not exactly sure.
We have another question from online from Michael Johnson. Very timely talk. I'm increasingly hearing from colleagues as well as media sources that our collective actions as medical educators and public health advocates regarding efficacy of vaccines and behavioral recommendations for preventing infections were wrong, effectively scientific and medical BS. How do we address this?
I think that doctors are often at this unique position. So we said credibility is basically a combination of trustworthiness and expertise. They're in this unique position because often they are the experts, but they're also parents. And what I would like to see more is doctors talking to their patients and acknowledging, for instance, that they're parents and saying, this is the decision that I made, telling their story, because then there's this added advantage. Otherwise, the sad truth is that anecdotes always win. There's just no way to fight it, right? There's no way to fight with people's personal experience, even if it's scientifically not going to reach the point of significance, right? There's no way to fight it. We as humans, we know that to just the mental resources that we require to process a narrative, to understand who are the characters, what's the relationship between them, that interfere with our ability to come to argue against that narrative. And also we know that to enjoy a story, we need to suspend our disbelief. And all these things make anecdotes so, so powerful.
Can I follow up?
Yeah.
Because I recall when Mandy Cohen first became the director of the CDC, she kind of changed the messaging, and she talked about COVID vaccines, boosters, as being what she was going to make sure her kids received, and everyone in her family had gotten it, and it was so helpful. I don't think that made a dent. I don't think it mattered. How should she have told that story better?
Well, I haven't heard about that story. So maybe just to make sure that it reaches more people. I also think that we need to, we need to get real. There's a mushy middle that we can influence. And then there are people that are definitely not vaccine hesitant. They're just resistant to vaccines. And there's no magic bullet, right? There's no magical phrase. There's no piece of evidence that will convince them. So that's, I think, a little bit more nuance in how we define things. Vaccine hesitancy became this catch-all phrase, and some people that 20 years ago would be classified as anti-vaxxers are now proudly calling themselves hesitant because hesitancy is so good. You're skeptic, you're an intellectual. You're just surfing the web, searching for scientific evidence, but you're not. And I think just a little bit more nuance there can also be helpful.
Any questions in the room? Okay, I'm going to go to another online question from Jeff Linder. Can you clarify your earlier response and differentiate what you want to really say versus the kumbaya answer?
Well, many of you have been on panels with people who are responsible for health communication or designing of campaigns. And it's gradually becoming less and less popular to say, we need to use fear appeals. Like the real cost campaign that the CDC had against tobacco is an extremely effective campaign. It has a bunch of disgust appeals and fear appeals, and there's a reason why it works. And more, there's a tendency now to talk about gain-framed messages as having this inherent benefit. This is not what the research shows us. So I think that often we want to think that we're going to fight the darkness, the misinformation with hope appeals. Well, good luck. This is not what the research tells us.
We have a bunch of other questions online, but we're not going to have time to get to them. So we'll try to answer them in the virtual world. We have one more question in the room here.
I really like your point on fear appeals, and I was wondering if you could kind of compare or discuss fear appeals versus social norms and affecting people's decision-making processes, because I know that being influenced by the people around us and even just feeding into their misinformation can also make us act a certain way, and which one you would think is more effective. Yeah,
well, in our work, they are a little bit separate. So fear appeals can be extremely effective, but only if three conditions need to be satisfied. It needs to be relevant, otherwise you're not going to be scared. It needs to show some level of self-efficacy. You can do it. There's a way for you to avoid the risk, to minimize the risk. Call this number, get this vaccine, and also response efficacy. There's a solution. And one of the, again, frustrating findings that we get, often the fear appeals that are directed at smokers they're definitely relevant. But if there's no self-efficacy or response efficacy, they just increase anxiety. Happen to know what happens to smokers when they get really anxious? Yeah, they want to smoke. And then normative appeals are slightly different. These are the cases where you want to influence people by telling them, this is what other people like you are doing. And there's such an interesting line of work, especially on college campuses. This is where the literature on social norms comes from. Like, for instance, binge drinking, right? So at first, the assumption was just explain to students that drinking is not healthy. Didn't help. The problem was these students had what we call imaginary peers, because when they were asked, how many drinks on average do you think other students in this college drink when they party, they would give a much higher number than the actual number. So then this is the reason if you walk around the Northwestern campus, often the messaging would be people at Northwestern drink only 2.5 drinks when they go out. So these are normative appeals. They are less direct, and they're designed to correct that misperception that we have between what actually happens and what people think happens.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Walter. This was extremely informative.
Thank you.